A man opens his front door at first light and finds the lane outside far too still. The stalls that usually fill the square have not been raised. A dog noses at a broken basket near the gutter. Somewhere beyond the church wall, a bell begins to ring again, not for the hour, but for another burial. He does not yet know how many more bells will follow before sunset. He only knows that the world he trusted a week ago has shifted into something thinner and colder. People who spoke with him in the market are suddenly behind closed shutters. A neighbor who seemed tired 2 days earlier is now said to be dead. Another house has tied cloth over its door. Another family has vanished from sight. Yet just across the lane, someone is sweeping a doorstep as if ordinary life might still be held together by routine alone. Before we go deeper into this long night of history, take a second to subscribe if this kind of quiet journey through the past is your kind of listening. And while you settle in, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what hour has found you there tonight. I always like imagining these old stories crossing time zones, rooms, cities, and sleepless hours before they reach another pair of ears. By the year 1348, scenes like that were unfolding across Europe with a speed and scale that few people had words for. The disease that later generations would call the Black Death had already traveled out of Asia along trade routes, moved through ports, crossed seas, and entered towns that had no way to measure what was coming. News traveled more slowly than illness, and rumor filled the space where certainty should have been. One city heard that another had been emptied. A port heard that a ship had arrived carrying death. A village heard that merchants on the road were collapsing with swellings in their groin or under their arms, followed by fever, weakness, and a terrible end. No one had microscopes. No one had germ theory. No one could point to a bacterium and say, "There, that is the thing destroying us." What people had instead were signs: sudden pain, dark marks, breath gone wrong, families breaking apart in a matter of days. For many listeners today, the Black Death lives in memory as a single giant fact. It killed half of Europe. That phrase has survived because it captures the emotional truth of the disaster, even though the exact losses changed from region to region. Some places suffered less, some suffered more. Modern historians often estimate that between a third and a half of Europe's population died in the Great Plague Wave of the late 1340s and early 1350s. Even the lower end of that range is almost impossible to picture. Imagine one person out of every 3 gone from your street, your building, your village, your school, your workplace. Imagine empty chairs becoming normal. Imagine learning not to ask where someone has gone, because the answer is almost always the same. And yet the mystery inside the title remains. Not everyone died. Many did. Perhaps tens of millions across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, but many did not. Some lived in towns that were hit hard and still survived. Some cared for the sick and lived. Some were exposed and recovered. Some were spared because the disease never reached them in full force. Others were saved by distance, timing, or plain luck so sharp and strange that later generations might mistake it for destiny. When death becomes so common that people stop counting carefully, survival begins to look almost supernatural. But there were reasons, or at least layers of reasons, and 1348 is where those layers begin to come into view. The plague did not begin in Europe. It arrived there. That matters, because its path shaped its damage. Long before medieval Europeans saw the first signs, networks of trade had already tied distant lands together more tightly than many people now imagine. Goods, textiles, grain, spices, metals, animals, and people were always moving. Caravans crossed inland routes. Ships moved through the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Ports were not just commercial places. They were points where entire worlds touched. A bundle of cloth, a sack of grain, a chest, a rope, a body, a flea, a rat hidden in darkness below deck. All of these could travel together without anyone knowing that one of them carried disaster. One of the most famous stories about the plague's entrance into Europe is tied to the Crimean port of Kaffa, where conflict, trade, and disease met in a way that later writers remembered vividly. Accounts written after the event describe plague among besieging forces and suggest that the disease traveled onward through trade ships leaving the Black Sea. Some details in these reports are debated, as many medieval accounts are, but the larger pattern is clear enough. By 1347, plague had reached Mediterranean ports. By 1348, it had spread widely through Europe. Sicily, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and other trading centers became gateways not only for commerce, but for infection. Once the disease found busy urban centers, it entered a world almost made for rapid transmission, even if medieval people would never have described it in those terms. Many towns were crowded. Houses could be small, dark, and close together. Animals and people often lived near each other. Food storage attracted rodents. Waste disposal was imperfect. Water could be contaminated. Streets were full of motion. Markets brought strangers into close contact. Inns turned roads into chains of human exchange. A disease that could ride trade and thrive in conditions of crowding had found one of the most connected regions on Earth. Still, Europe in 1348 was not one single uniform landscape. That is one reason the plague's damage was uneven. The Europe of that year contained great cities, market towns, fishing communities, mountain villages, monasteries, farms, castles, and islands. Roads varied in quality. Wealth varied sharply. Climate varied. Population density varied. The disease did not pour over the continent like water covering a floor. It moved through channels. Some channels were broad and fast. Others were narrow. Some places stood directly in its path. Others lay just beyond the busiest arteries and faced a different rhythm of danger. To people living through it, though, those patterns were hard to see. What they saw instead was collapse arriving in pieces. One house first, then two, then a lane, then a parish. Then a market. Priests were called, then more priests, then too few remained. Doctors visited, though medicine in the 14th century had little power against plague. Family members stayed to help, or fled, or prayed, or tried both. Local officials in some places attempted rules about burial, movement, commerce, or cleaning. Elsewhere, orders simply thinned. There are records from the period that speak of mass graves, abandoned property, interrupted court business, and labor suddenly hard to find. Not every report is equally reliable, and medieval writers sometimes used large numbers dramatically, but even allowing for exaggeration, the pattern is unmistakable. Normal life could not hold under repeated blows of this size. One of the clearest windows into how people felt comes from writers who lived close to the event. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, left one of the most famous descriptions of plague society in the introduction to the Decameron. He wrote of fear, of changing human behavior, of parents and children separated by terror, of bodies carried away, and of social bonds under strain. Boccaccio was a literary writer, not a modern public health observer, and his account mixes observation with crafted narrative, but it remains valuable because it captures a truth deeper than statistics. The plague did not simply kill bodies, it altered the habits that made a community feel like a community. People no longer knew whom to trust, whom to touch, or which obligations they were still capable of carrying. The loneliness of plague is one of the hardest parts to imagine. Medieval life was communal in ways that modern life often is not. Work, worship, food, craft, law, and memory were shared physically. People lived close. They prayed together. They buried together. They marked feast days together. When plague entered such a world, it did not only threaten life, it threatened the very acts through which people recognized each other as human neighbors. What does kindness look like when kindness may infect you? What happens to duty when duty becomes deadly? Those questions rose again and again in 1348. Some fled. Wealthier people, when they had warning and means, could sometimes leave cities for country estates or more isolated places. That did not always save them, and flight could spread disease along the road. But mobility itself was a form of unequal power. A poor laborer tied to work, rent, or simple lack of transport did not have the same choices. A servant might have to remain with a household whether or not plague had entered it. A priest might remain because souls still needed him. A physician, barber-surgeon, or caregiver might remain because there was no one else. Each role carried different risks. Even before we speak of immunity or biology, survival had already begun to separate along lines of class, duty, location, and timing. Yet wealth was no magic shield. Cities that had rich quarters still buried rich people. Noble houses lost heirs. Monasteries lost monks in numbers so severe that entire religious communities were reshaped. Records from ecclesiastical institutions often provide some of the clearest signs of mortality because clerics kept documents when they still could. In some places, large portions of clergy died, partly because they were called repeatedly into homes of sickness and burial. To be useful in plague years was often to be exposed. That is one of history's crueler patterns. The people most committed to serving others could become the people most likely to die. Medieval medicine did not help much, though it tried to make sense of events with the intellectual tools available at the time. Learned medicine in Europe drew heavily on ancient authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates, interpreted through centuries of commentary. Health was often understood through balance, humors, diet, air, season, and environment. Disease might be linked to corruption in the air, unusual weather, celestial alignments, or local foulness. Some treatments attempted purging, bloodletting, herbs, or scented substances to protect against bad air. There were also practical responses that were not entirely foolish, even if their reasoning was mistaken. People who avoided the sick sometimes did reduce their risk. People who limited contact sometimes survived. They did not know about bacteria, but behavior still mattered. And behavior changed quickly under pressure. Some accounts describe households sealing themselves away. Others speak of people abandoning the sick, though not all did. Some formed small circles and tried to limit company. Others turned to heavy drinking or pleasure, convinced that life was short. Some processed publicly in prayer. Some blamed outsiders, minorities, or imagined plotters. Across Europe, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to persecution and massacres in many places. These horrors did not come from science, of course. They came from fear, looking for a target. When people cannot see the true cause of suffering, they often choose a visible one. The plague exposed not only vulnerability to disease, but vulnerability to panic and cruelty. Even among all this fear, survival kept appearing in strange, uneven ways. One house might lose everyone. The next might lose no one. A mother might die while a child lives. A servant might die while a master survives. A priest might visit many infected homes and remain standing for months, while another falls after one call. From a modern distance, we want a single explanation. We want a neat answer, because the scale of death feels unbearable without one. But plague does not fit neatly into a moral lesson. Survival did not always reward virtue. Death did not always follow vice. The disease moved through conditions, bodies, and networks that were messy, unequal, and unpredictable. This is why the statistic about half of Europe, powerful as it is, can hide as much as it reveals. A continent-wide estimate turns millions of individual experiences into one enormous number. That number is useful for grasping the shock. It is less useful for understanding why some survived. To do that, we need to move closer to lived reality. Imagine two villages separated by a river crossing that traders use only occasionally. One receives more traffic, stores more grain, and holds larger weekly markets. The other is poorer, smaller, and less connected. The first may be struck earlier and harder. Or imagine a family that leaves town at the first rumor of sickness, compared with another that stays because they cannot leave, or because they do not believe the rumors, or because someone is already ill. Those differences do not sound dramatic when listed plainly. In 1348, they could decide everything. There is another difficulty as well. Medieval record-keeping was uneven. Some deaths were counted, many were not. Chroniclers often wrote from specific cities or institutions, and their experiences could feel universal, even when they were not. Some later writers repeated earlier numbers without checking them. Entire regions are clearer to us than others, because more documents survive. So when historians say Europe may have lost between 30 and 50% of its population, they are working carefully with fragmentary evidence, tax records, wills, manorial accounts, church records, court interruptions, and later demographic reconstruction. The picture is broad, but not perfect. And yet, even with those limits, the scale of death remains beyond dispute. By the spring and summer of 1348, many European communities had moved beyond rumor. They knew. Bells rang too often. Burial ground filled too quickly. Labor vanished. Animals wandered masterless. Legal business stalled because officials were dead or absent. In some towns, plague became the background against which every other decision was made. Can grain still be unloaded? Can this marriage proceed? Can rents be collected? Can a priest be found? Can the dead be buried before the air grows worse? Such questions sound practical, almost cold, but they are part of what survival meant. Surviving plague was not only avoiding infection, it was also making it through a world whose ordinary systems were coming apart. That collapse itself could kill. Hunger, neglect, fear, and lost care all matter in a mortality crisis. If a parent dies, a child may die later for lack of food or help. If a servant flees, the sick may worsen alone. If fields are untended, shortages follow. If transport breaks down, supplies fail. If priests die, the comfort people depend on vanishes. Disease sets off chains, and those chains widen its shadow. So when we ask why some survived, we are not only asking who resisted the bacterium, we are also asking who remained in households that still functioned, who had food, who had people around them, who was not abandoned, who was not trapped in the wrong kind of work, who was not left inside a failing social net. And then there is chance, the hardest factor for the human mind to accept. Chance feels unsatisfying because it offers no lesson, yet history is full of it. A merchant may arrive a week later than planned. A road may be washed out. A rat-infested cargo may be unloaded on one quay instead of another. A flea may bite one person and not the person sleeping beside him. A traveler with early symptoms may choose one inn over the next. A household may leave town a day before exposure. Another may welcome a visitor who seems merely tired. When enough people are involved, chance begins to look like pattern. Sometimes it is pattern. Sometimes it is chance wearing the mask of pattern. Still, not all survival can be left to luck. Even in the middle of terror, medieval people noticed things. Some places began experimenting with forms of separation. Some avoided goods or contacts they feared were dangerous. Some wealthy households withdrew. Some city authorities later developed more organized responses, and in the centuries after the first Black Death wave, Italian city-states in particular would become known for quarantine measures. In 1348, understanding was crude, but the basic human instinct to pull away from contagion was already present. People did not know the exact enemy, yet they were not blind to its habits. Survival sometimes began with observation, even when the explanation was wrong. The same town that looked doomed from one angle could look strangely selective from another. A street may lose 5 homes and spare 3. A monastery may lose half its members and keep the rest. A noble family may bury its head in air, yet leave younger children alive. This unevenness must have been deeply confusing to those living through it. If plague were divine punishment, why spare one sinner and not another? If it were poisoned air, why did the same air not kill everyone in one room? If it were fate, why did fate move so irregularly? The plague did not simply terrify medieval people. It also shattered easy explanation. That fracture between what people saw and what they could explain is where much of the era's mental anguish lived. By the end of 1348, in many parts of Europe, whole communities had entered a new emotional world. The old assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday had been broken. The future felt thinner. Yet among the dead, there remained the living, and their presence posed a question as haunting as the graves themselves. Why them? Why not them? Why did one body fail in 2 days while another body, equally frightened, remained upright long enough to bury the first? That question followed survivors into the years after the worst wave had passed, and in a sense, it has never quite left. If we stay with the people in that silent lane from the beginning, we can begin to see the shape of the mystery. The man at the door is not only looking at death, he is looking at uneven death. He is seeing something selective, something that seems to choose without warning. One house behind shutters, one house still sweeping its step, one priest gone, another still walking, one child buried. Another fevered, then well again. Medieval Europe did not yet know the name Yersinia pestis. It did not know what a bacterium was. It did not know how fleas, rodents, breath, and contact could intersect in different forms of plague. But the puzzle was already there in full view. And once that puzzle appears, the streets themselves are no longer enough. We have seen the bells, the fear, the closed doors, the collapsing order of 1348. The next thing we need to do is move away from what people could see and toward what they could not, because the reasons some survived begin in an enemy too small for them to imagine, moving quietly through a world that had no name for it. For the people who lived through the Black Death, the plague announced itself through signs they could see, hear, and smell. A healthy-looking traveler arrived tired and pale, and within a few days he was dead. A swelling appeared under the arm, near the neck, or deep in the groin. Fever rose. The body weakened. In some cases, dark patches appeared on the skin, marks that later generations would remember with special fear. Breathing sometimes changed. A person who could stand in the morning might be unable to rise by nightfall. In a world without microscopes, blood tests, or modern anatomy, illness could only be judged by the body's outward distress. Medieval people were not foolish for working from appearances. That was all any human being in their place could do. Yet the plague's deepest workings were hidden from them, and because they were hidden, many of the explanations people reached were only partly right, or very wrong, or tragically dangerous. Today, most historians and scientists agree that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. That name belongs to modern science, not to the 14th century. No one in 1348 could have spoken it. But the disease itself was already old. Long before Europeans found themselves facing it in terror, plague had moved through other parts of the world. It belonged to a larger ecological system involving animals, parasites, climate, trade, and human movement. Europe was not visited by an isolated curse. It was drawn into a biological chain that had been forming far beyond the awareness of the people it would strike. A bacterium is a tiny living organism, far too small to see with the naked eye. Some bacteria are harmless, some are useful, some are deadly. Yersinia pestis belongs to the third group. One of the strange things about plague is that the bacterium itself is only one part of the story. For much of its history, plague has depended on relationships between rodents and fleas. Fleas feed on blood. Rodents live near stored food, cargo, grain, and human settlement. Where rodents travel, fleas can travel. Where trade moves goods across great distances, hidden animal passengers may move with them. Human beings can spend years building routes of wealth and communication, only to find that those same routes can carry destruction with dreadful efficiency. This does not mean every case of plague always follows one single path. Disease is rarely that tidy. Modern scholarship still debates the relative role of rats, fleas, human ectoparasites such as lice, and direct respiratory spread in different outbreaks and different settings. That debate matters, but for a listener drifting through the broad shape of 1348, the essential point is clearer than the technical arguments. The Black Death moved through living carriers. It did not drift across Europe as pure bad luck in the air. It followed contacts, bodies, goods, and environments. Trade helped it. Density helped it. Narrow rooms, food stores, crowded ports, and constant movement helped it. A disease that thrives where humans and animals live in close relation will always find opportunity in a busy commercial world. In medieval Europe, no one knew this. People could notice that plague traveled with roads, ships, and market towns. They could notice that crowded places often suffered. They could notice that some houses became centers of sickness and that contact seemed dangerous. Yet noticing patterns is not the same as understanding cause. If a town reeks in summer and disease rises at the same time, bad air seems like a reasonable suspect. If plague follows foreigners or merchants, strangers seem suspicious. If catastrophe arrives after odd weather, failed harvests, earthquakes, or comets, it is natural to imagine a connection. Human beings build explanations from whatever ideas their culture has ready. 14th century Europe had no germ theory waiting on a shelf. It had religion, ancient medicine, astrology, local rumor, memory, and fear. One of the most widespread ideas linked disease to corrupted air, often called miasma by later writers. Air that smelled foul, air near rot, swamps, filth, burial places, or stagnant waste seemed dangerous because it often was associated with sickness of various kinds. Medieval people were not entirely mistaken to worry about environment. Dirty, crowded places do contribute to disease. The error lay in thinking that plague itself floated as poisoned atmosphere rather than moving through precise biological routes. Even so, miasma theory sometimes pushed people toward behaviors that accidentally reduced risk. If someone avoided crowded, foul-smelling places, opened space around the household, or withdrew from the sick because the air seemed corrupted, that person might in some cases have reduced exposure. A false explanation can still produce a partly useful habit. Another line of thought linked the plague to divine anger. This, too, was understandable within the worldview of the time. Medieval Europe was not secular in the modern sense. God was woven into law, nature, weather, fortune, kingship, illness, birth, and death. If an entire community was struck by a disaster beyond ordinary experience, many asked what sin had called it down. Such thinking brought people toward prayer, repentance, confession, processions, acts of charity, and vows. For some, it offered emotional structure. Suffering is harder to bear when it appears random. To imagine divine purpose, even frightening purpose, is to imagine that chaos still answers to some order. Yet, religious explanation had dark edges. When suffering must be blamed on sin, people often begin searching for sinners, and that search does not stay gentle for long. Astrology also played a role. Learned medical writers sometimes connected outbreaks to celestial events, planetary alignments, or corruptions in the atmosphere brought about by the heavens. To a modern listener, this may sound distant and strange, but medieval astronomy and astrology existed close together. The sky was not only beautiful, it was meaningful. A conjunction of planets might be treated as a sign of earthly disturbance. If air, weather, and the body were all thought to be linked, celestial irregularity could appear medically relevant. Again, this was not mere foolishness. It was an attempt, using inherited systems of knowledge, to fit an overwhelming event into a map of cause and effect. Yet the plague also encouraged cruder theories, especially among frightened crowds. Wells were said to have been poisoned, travelers were blamed, minorities were accused. Long-standing prejudice against Jewish communities, already present in Europe before the plague, turned murderous in many places. Under torture, some people were forced into false confessions. Entire communities were attacked, burned, expelled, or massacred. The cruelty is impossible to separate from the disease because it became part of the social history of the plague. When the true cause of suffering is invisible, fear often chooses a visible target. The Black Death was biological, but its human consequences were shaped by imagination, rumor, power, and hatred. If we want to understand why some people survived, it matters that medieval explanations were incomplete, because incomplete explanations changed behavior. A family that thought plague came from bad air might burn herbs, carry flowers, hang aromatic plants, or stay away from foul-smelling places. A town that thought outsiders carried the sickness might restrict arrivals. A priest who believed plague was punishment might spend more time hearing confessions among the dying. A wealthy household convinced that the city air had turned deadly might flee to the countryside. Some of these choices reduced exposure. Some increased it. Some had no real effect at all. In other words, belief became part of risk. Modern medicine usually speaks of plague in three main forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. These are useful categories, though real illness can be messy, and not every case fits a clean textbook picture. Bubonic plague is the form most people picture first. The bacterium enters the body, often through a flea bite, and the lymph nodes swell painfully. These swellings, called buboes, often appear in the groin, armpit, or neck because lymph nodes in those areas are part of the body's defense network. The swelling can become severe and frightening. Fever, weakness, vomiting, pain, and delirium may follow. Untreated bubonic plague is extremely dangerous, but some people do survive it. That fact is important. Even within one form of plague, death was not automatic in every case. Septicemic plague is more severe still. In this form, the bacteria multiply in the bloodstream. The body enters a rapidly failing state. Tissue may darken as circulation collapses. Shock can follow. A person may die before clear buboes even appear, or before those around them fully grasp what is happening. This form helps explain why plague could seem almost supernatural in speed. There are moments in medieval descriptions where death appears to spring from nowhere, but in medical terms, the body may have already been overwhelmed internally. Pneumonic plague attacks the lungs and can spread through respiratory droplets, meaning it can move directly from person to person through close contact, especially in enclosed spaces. This is one reason plague could be so terrifying in households, sick rooms, monasteries, and dense urban housing. If breath itself becomes dangerous, ordinary acts of care turn into acts of exposure. A family member sitting near the bed, a priest hearing last confession, a servant carrying water, a washer handling cloth, all might be drawn into the disease's circle. Pneumonic plague is especially deadly when untreated. In a medieval setting, with no antibiotics and little real understanding, it could move through close social bonds with brutal speed. These distinctions help us see why survival was uneven. Not every person encountered the same form of plague in the same way. One person may have been bitten by an infected flea and developed bubonic plague. Another may have cared for someone coughing blood and faced pneumonic infection. Another may have had some contact with infected goods or spaces, but not enough to fall ill. Another may have been exposed, but received too small a bacterial load to trigger severe disease, or their immune system may have fought it off. This begins to answer part of the mystery. The plague was not one uniform blow landing identically on every body. Consider a ship entering port in the late 1340s. In the hold, there may be grain, cloth, rope, barrels, tools, food, and stowaway rodents. The sailors interact with dock workers. Dock workers return home. Merchants handle goods. Carters move cargo inland. Innkeepers host travelers. The chain expands outward. Yet even within this chain, exposure differs. A dock worker unloading infested cargo may face greater danger than a clerk who only records the shipment. A warehouse crowded with rodents may become more dangerous than a stone house on a cleaner street. A merchant who travels repeatedly between ports may encounter risk again and again, while a shepherd inland sees little traffic for weeks. Exposure is not only about whether the plague exists. It is about where exactly it travels, how concentrated it is, and who crosses its path. Rodents matter here because plague has long existed in animal reservoirs. Some rodent populations can carry plague organisms in ways that help keep the disease alive in nature. Others die in large numbers, pushing infected fleas to search for new hosts, including humans. Medieval people certainly noticed dead rats or other animals at times, though they did not interpret them correctly. If rodents began dying in unusual numbers around food stores, docks, or markets, a hidden transition might already be underway. Fleas deprived of their usual hosts could turn toward people living close by. The human community might experience the result before it ever noticed the animal warning. Even this picture, though, may be too simple if taken as a single universal model. Some scholars argue that human fleas or lice may have played a larger role during the Black Death than older rat-centered explanations allowed, especially in colder regions or indoor environments where close human contact and poor hygiene made body parasites common. This matters because it reminds us not to imagine the medieval plague world as a neat modern diagram. Different pathways may have mattered in different settings. Ports and grain stores may have favored one pattern. Crowded homes, inns, and institutions may have favored another. The disease was adaptable enough to exploit many forms of closeness. Season also shaped the plague's motion. Warmer months affected flea activity, human travel, trade intensity, and food storage conditions. Some outbreaks surged in particular seasons and weakened in others. Climate could alter how quickly goods moved, how communities gathered, how animals behaved, and how people interpreted illness. If plague seemed worse in one season than another, contemporaries might attribute that to heat, foul vapors, or divine timing. Yet behind those impressions were ecological rhythms that modern science can partly trace. Survival, again, was tied not only to who you were, but to when the disease reached your town and what conditions it found there. There is a quiet cruelty in how much medieval life unknowingly helped the plague. Grain had to be stored, ships had to sail, markets had to open, inns had to welcome travelers. Families had to sleep close together in small spaces. Waste could not always be removed cleanly. Clothing was reworn. Bedding was shared. Animals lived near people. All of this was normal. None of it was a moral failure. But plague makes ordinary life look dangerous in retrospect. A sack of grain is no longer just grain. It becomes a possible shelter for vermin. A warm blanket is no longer only comfort. It becomes a place where parasites may linger. A crowded feast day is no longer only community. It becomes proximity, breath, and contact. This is one reason historical epidemics are emotionally difficult to imagine. War at least appears dramatic. Famine can be pictured in empty fields, but plague hides in the useful and the familiar. The road that brings salt also brings disease. The warehouse that protects food also shelters rats. The bed where one person is cared for becomes the bed where the next person falls ill. The plague did not need Europe to become wicked. It only needed Europe to be interconnected. Medieval medical writers tried hard to respond within the framework they possessed. Some wrote plague tracts advising people on diet, cleanliness, emotional restraint, and the avoidance of corrupted air. They recommended certain foods, discouraged excess, and promoted balance. They warned against fear and despair, believing that strong emotion could weaken the body. Some advice sounds alien now. Some sounds almost sensible. Fresh air, separation, and caution around the sick could help, even when the explanation behind them was inaccurate. It is tempting to laugh at scented cloths or herbal bundles held to the nose, but a person covering the mouth and keeping distance from infection may accidentally be doing something useful. We should be careful not to flatten medieval people into two false types, the ignorant masses and the wise moderns. Real history is never that clean. They lacked key knowledge, yes. They also noticed patterns with remarkable seriousness. City authorities learned from repeated experience. Some ports began monitoring arrivals more closely. Households changed behavior. Local officials experimented. By the later 14th and 15th centuries, more formal quarantine systems would emerge in parts of Europe, especially around the Mediterranean. These measures did not spring from perfect science, but from observation that movement and contact mattered. Even before the bacterium was known, plague was teaching lessons about separation. The word quarantine itself would later be tied to periods of isolation for ships, goods, and travelers, especially in Italian maritime settings. 40 days became a meaningful interval. But in 1348, the first great European wave was still ahead of such developed practice. Communities were improvising under pressure. Some barred entry, some fled, some prayed, some blamed, some cleaned, some did all of these at once. Their choices formed a rough map of risk. Not everyone survived because they understood the plague. Many survived because a mistaken theory happened to lead them away from exposure. A wealthy merchant family leaving a city for a rural villa may have told itself that country air was purer. In one sense, that explanation belonged to miasma theory. Yet the move also reduced time spent in the crowded commercial world where plague circulated intensely. They left the port, the market, the dense housing, the constant visitors. Their theory was wrong. Their altered exposure might still save them. A monastery that closed its gates from fear of bad air or moral contamination might also reduce contact with infected travelers. A frightened villager who avoided a sick neighbor from dread of poisoned breath might reduce the chance of pneumonic spread. Human beings do not need a perfect explanation to stumble toward a useful response. Still, many useful-seeming responses failed. Burning incense could not purify a flea bite. Perfume could not rescue someone already septicemic. Prayer might soothe the mind, but it could also gather crowds in exactly the kind of proximity that increased danger. Flagellant movements, in which groups traveled publicly in acts of penance, may have deepened transmission by bringing people together and moving from place to place. A noble fleeing the city could bring infection to a country estate that had not yet seen it. A servant carrying bedding out to be aired could bring parasites along with cloth. A doctor examining the sick, confident in his learned training, could die like anyone else. The line between prudence and futility was hard to see in real time. Because medieval people did not know the exact routes of transmission, they often treated plague as more mysterious than it really was, but less selective than it actually was. They knew it could strike horribly fast. They knew contact mattered in some way. They knew some places became dangerous. What they did not know was why the danger clustered where it did. They could not see vectors. They could not distinguish forms of plague clearly. They could not calculate how animal reservoirs, parasites, respiratory spread, and human movement overlapped. That ignorance made the disease feel almost willful, as if it were choosing houses and bodies with secret intention. The result was a strange combination of randomness and pattern. The plague did follow patterns, but those patterns were too fine-grained to be visible without later science. A dockside quarter might be hit before a hilltop neighborhood. A house storing grain might become a point of danger. A family with many visitors might face different risks from one living more quietly. A person sleeping in close contact with the ill might face a different form of infection than a person passing briefly through the same room. A traveler arriving from an infected port might bring plague into one inn and not another. All of these are patterns, but to the people living through them, they often appeared as chaotic judgment. This helps explain the emotional force of survival. If disease seems invisible and selective, the person who survives looks marked by something hard to name. Perhaps God spared them. Perhaps their constitution was stronger. Perhaps they were simply fortunate. Medieval language could move among all these possibilities. A modern historian can add ecology, transmission routes, and biology, but even modern knowledge does not remove all uncertainty. Two people can still be exposed differently in ways that no record captures. One may have brushed against infected cloth. Another stood farther away. One had a flea bite on the ankle and forgot it. Another did not. One breathed in a small room beside a coughing patient. Another left the room earlier. History rarely preserves such details. There is another hidden aspect to the plague's invisibility: delay. Cause and effect were not always immediate. A ship arrives. Goods are unloaded. Rats disperse. Fleas shift hosts. A worker feels ill days later. Another household sickens after that. A market declines only after the first rumors spread. By the time a community recognizes the pattern, the chain is already well established. This delay makes containment much harder. People act on what they can see, but the real process began earlier, in moments that seemed harmless at the time. For people in 1348, that delay made the world feel treacherous. Yesterday's harmless visit becomes today's source of fear. The blanket used in comfort may become suspect. The ship welcomed for profit may become remembered as a floating grave. The road that linked one town to the next now feels like a wound cut across the land. Even affection becomes uncertain. Can you kiss your child if the child is feverish? Can you hold a spouse? Can you wash a body? The invisible nature of the disease turned ordinary human tenderness into a field of risk. And yet, in that same invisibility lies one answer to the mystery of survival. Some people lived because the plague never reached them in the same way it reached others. They were not necessarily wiser, braver, or morally better. They were positioned differently within the disease's hidden map. They lived farther from ports, markets, dense houses, infested stores, coughing patients, or heavily traveled roads. They encountered the wrong flea later or not at all. They were in towns that saw only a light touch instead of a storm. They fled early. They stayed isolated. They avoided one room, one inn, one cart, one visit. A slight change in contact could decide the difference between grief and survival. That is only part of the story, though. The plague's carriers and pathways explain why danger was uneven. They do not fully explain why some exposed people recovered while others died. For that, we will need to move closer to the human map of the epidemic: the villages, cities, monasteries, islands, roads, households, and occupations that stood in different relation to the same disease. Because once the invisible enemy entered Europe, it did not treat every place alike, and the geography of survival begins to show us why death could pass over one door while entering the next. If you were standing over a map of Europe in the year 1348, with no knowledge of bacteria and no way to see what traveled in cargo, cloth, fur, grain, and breath, the plague might appear to move like a dark stain spreading from one edge of the page to another. That image is powerful, and in a broad sense, it captures the horror. The disease did spread widely. It crossed borders, languages, climates, and kingdoms. Yet when historians look more closely, the stain stops looking smooth. It breaks apart. Some regions were struck early, some later. Some towns were devastated. Some suffered less. Some monasteries nearly emptied, while certain villages escaped with losses that, though still painful, were nowhere near the worst seen elsewhere. The plague was massive, but it was not uniform. For that reason, one of the most important answers to the mystery of survival has nothing to do with individual courage or hidden immunity. It has to do with place. Place sounds simple at first. It suggests geography. And geography does matter. Mountains, rivers, marshes, roads, coastlines, islands, and distance all shape the movement of disease. But place in the plague years meant more than landscape. It also meant how people lived inside that landscape. Were they crowded into tight streets or scattered across farmsteads? Did they trade often or rarely? Did they receive ships, caravans, pilgrims, and officials? Were they enclosed by walls? Did they host a market every week? Did they store large amounts of grain? Did they live with animals under the same roof? Did they have the means to leave? Were they required by duty to stay? Two towns might be only a few days apart and still occupy very different positions in the plague's path. This is why survival can seem so strange when viewed up close. A large city might lose an enormous share of its people, while a smaller settlement in the hills suffers far less. A port might become a center of repeated outbreaks, while a village away from main roads hears of plague long before it sees it. One noble estate might bury many servants after receiving refugees from town, while another, more isolated and more tightly managed, keeps most of its household alive. A monastery connected to urban charity might be devastated because monks continue tending the sick, while a remote religious house with little traffic sees fewer deaths. The plague did not only choose between individuals. It also chose, or seemed to choose, among kinds of human settlement. Ports were among the most dangerous places in the first wave, because ports were where long-distance trade gathered itself into concentrated form. A harbor was not just a shore. It was a meeting point for ships, cargo, laborers, merchants, animals, and storage spaces. Goods that had traveled across seas were unloaded into warehouses, handled by workers, moved through markets, and carried inland. In such places, the plague found many ways to anchor itself. The first major European outbreaks were heavily tied to maritime entry points, especially around the Mediterranean. Sicily, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and other active ports became early stations in the disease's passage. Once plague entered such places, it had immediate access to dense populations and inland trade routes. Urban life added another layer of danger. Medieval cities were not all the same, but many shared certain features that helped disease. Streets could be narrow. Waste management was limited. Houses might be packed closely together. The poor often lived in cramped conditions. Craft work, food storage, and trade all created spaces where animals, goods, and people intersected constantly. In a city, contact is ordinary. One does not have to choose exposure deliberately. Exposure happens through work, commerce, worship, lodging, and daily survival. A baker buys grain, a porter moves sacks, a servant carries laundry. A priest visits the sick, an innkeeper hosts strangers, a widow sells food in the market, a clerk handles deliveries, a child plays in an alley where refuse gathers. Each act is ordinary. Together, they form a web. The plague moved along that web. By contrast, many rural communities were arranged differently. This did not make them safe in any absolute sense. Rural Europe could suffer terribly, and some villages disappeared or were permanently weakened. But distance and lower density sometimes changed the rhythm of infection. A family living on a scattered farmstead might have fewer daily contacts than a family in a city quarter. A village far from major roads might be exposed later than a market town at a crossroads. A shepherd on upland pasture did not meet the same stream of strangers as a dock worker in a port. A hamlet with limited trade and little movement could, in some cases, be touched lightly, or only after surrounding regions had already been struck. That delay alone could save lives. Some people fled before the disease arrived. Others learned from rumor and altered behavior. Time was not a cure, but it was sometimes a shield. The importance of roads is easy to miss if we think only in modern maps. 14th century roads varied widely in use and quality. Some were major arteries of commerce and state power. Others were local tracks, used mainly by nearby communities. A plague moving along heavy trade routes does not disperse evenly into every direction. It follows traffic. A town on a major route may receive news, goods, officials, and infection earlier than a village a short distance away, but off the main line of movement. To a medieval observer, that difference might appear mysterious or divine. To us, it suggests network behavior. Disease follows contact, and contact has structure. River systems mattered too. Rivers connected inland regions to ports and markets. They helped move grain, timber, cloth, wine, salt, and people. A river town with active traffic could function as a secondary hub after infection entered the coast. The same is true of fairs and pilgrimage routes. Medieval Europe had recurring points of human concentration: seasonal markets, religious centers, shrines, legal gatherings, and military movements. Any one of these could tighten the web through which disease traveled. A place does not need to be large to be vulnerable. It only needs to be connected in the wrong way. At the other end of this spectrum lay more isolated communities. Islands are an obvious example, though isolation was never perfect. Some islands were heavily engaged in trade and thus highly exposed. Others were small, remote, or less frequently connected. The same place that protected through separation could become vulnerable the moment a boat arrived from an infected harbor. Isolation was not immunity. It was reduced opportunity for transmission. A mountain village might be difficult to reach in winter and thus spared for a time, yet exposed later when travel resumed. A monastery in rough country might remain relatively untouched until a messenger, novice, supplier, or pilgrim brought illness through the gate. Protection through place was always temporary and conditional. Still, temporary and conditional could mean the difference between life and death. One of the great facts of plague history is that timing mattered almost as much as geography. A town struck early faced the disease before nearby communities had seen clear warning. A town struck later might already be acting on rumor, fear, or direct reports from neighboring places. People might flee sooner. Authorities might restrict entry. Markets might thin out. Travelers might be turned away. Households might become suspicious of contact. In some places, this response helped. In others, it merely shifted the pattern. Those who left cities often carried disease into country districts. Yet even then, the unevenness remained. One estate receives fleeing relatives and becomes a node of infection. Another refuses guests and survives with fewer losses. One village welcomes returning workers and sickens. Another closes itself more tightly and delays its exposure. The role of walls is also more complicated than it first appears. Medieval walls protected against armies, raiders, and theft, but in plague years they could both help and harm. A walled city could control its gates and sometimes restrict movement. That offered a certain advantage if authorities acted early and firmly. But once plague was inside, walls also enclosed density. A crowded town with disease already established might become a trap. A village without walls but with scattered housing and little traffic might, under some conditions, fare better simply because daily life involved less intense contact. So walls were not a guarantee of safety. Their value depended on whether they kept the plague out and on how life inside them was structured. Some of the clearest social differences in plague mortality appear when we consider occupation. Not all work carried the same risk. A gravedigger, a washer of linens, a servant in a large household, an innkeeper, a market porter, a physician, a barber surgeon, or a priest might be brought repeatedly into contact with the sick or with contaminated spaces. A plowman working more alone in the fields lived differently. A shepherd lived differently. A merchant moved through networks of exchange more than a village widow tending a small garden, though poverty could place that widow in other forms of vulnerability. Risk was uneven because labor placed bodies in different relation to the disease. Priests are a striking case. Clergy often suffered heavily in plague years because their role required proximity to the sick and dying. They heard confessions, administered rites, oversaw burial, and provided comfort. When ordinary social contact was retreating, many priests moved toward danger rather than away from it. Some did so out of conviction, some out of duty, some because communities demanded it, and some perhaps because there was no one else left. Episcopal records from the period often show waves of clerical vacancies that had to be filled after plague struck. These records are grim, but they teach an important lesson. Survival was partly determined by what one was expected to do. To serve could be to die. The same was true for caregivers within the household. Wives tended husbands, daughters tended mothers, servants tended masters, and neighbors sometimes tended each other despite fear. A person who withdrew might live. A person who stayed close out of love or obligation might die. The plague placed affection and duty under unbearable pressure. This matters because it complicates any simple story of wisdom. Some survivors were careful and fortunate. Others were merely absent from the point of exposure. Some who died did not make mistakes. They performed acts of care. Monasteries and convents present another revealing pattern. These were enclosed communities, which might sound protective, but enclosure did not always help. Members lived close together, prayed together, ate together, and often shared buildings intensively. Some religious houses had frequent outside contact through charity, pilgrims, education, administration, or dependence on urban networks. If plague entered such a community, it could move through shared routines with terrible force. Yet not all houses suffered alike. A remote monastery, with little traffic, might do better than one near a city or major route. A house that closed itself more strictly after early warnings might fare better than one already engaged in care for surrounding populations. Again, place and social function worked together. Nobility and wealth added yet another layer. Richer households sometimes had options that poorer people lacked. They could leave the city. They could occupy larger residences with more space. They could reduce contact by relying on servants. They could choose cleaner environments, though they would not have described them in modern terms. They could avoid crowded markets by drawing on stored resources. These advantages mattered, yet plague also found ways through wealth. Noble households received visitors, messengers, tenants, clergy, and goods. Servants moved between worlds. If a great household fled too late, it could carry infection with it. If it enclosed itself tightly after exposure had already entered, status did little good. There is a temptation to imagine the rich escaping while the poor died, but the real pattern is more mixed. Wealth altered risk. It did not erase it. Poverty, on the other hand, often meant intense dependence on local labor, crowded living conditions, and fewer choices. A poor urban laborer could not simply stop working or abandon the city for months. A servant might have to remain in an infected house. A widow might rely on daily selling in the market. A tenant farmer might be tied to obligations that continued even in crisis. Poorer households also had less margin against secondary effects. If a wage earner died, the rest of the family might follow through hunger or neglect, even without direct infection. So when historians think about survival, they are not only asking who avoided the bacterium, they are also asking who had enough social and material support to endure the larger collapse around it. There were early attempts, even in the 14th century, to control movement and contact. These did not yet form the mature quarantine systems of later centuries, but they show that people were learning. Some towns restricted outsiders. Some tried to manage burial practices. Some closed or altered markets. Some households isolated themselves. Some ports became cautious about incoming ships, though responses varied and were often too late. The lack of modern science did not mean the lack of practical intelligence. Communities could see that certain forms of movement carried danger. The problem was that they were trying to identify a hidden enemy through symptoms alone, often after transmission had already begun. A later and famous example of organized plague control can be seen in the city-state measures that developed in places like Venice and Dubrovnik, where isolation of travelers and goods became more systematic over time. These belong partly to later decades and centuries, so they should not be projected too neatly onto 1348. Still, they show how observation gradually hardened into public practice. People learned that separation mattered. They learned that the sea could bring danger. They learned that not every arrival should be welcomed at once. This learning cost countless lives. It was a knowledge bought by repeated catastrophe. For survival in 1348 itself, even crude separation could matter. A household that stopped taking visitors after hearing of plague in the next town might reduce its risk. A village that delayed its annual gathering might avoid one cluster of contact. A monastery that closed its gates early might fare better. A manor that barred movement from the nearby town might protect those within, though at moral cost if the sick were refused. A merchant who postponed travel by a few weeks might avoid a port at its worst moment. None of these actions guaranteed anything, but plague history is full of probabilities. Small changes in contact, especially early, could alter entire chains of transmission. Sometimes survival was tied to sheer remoteness. There are scattered reports and later traditions of communities that escaped the worst of the first wave because they were hard to reach or lightly connected. We should be careful with local legends that claim miraculous immunity. Many were shaped by later pride or selective memory. Yet the larger principle holds. In an age when travel was slower and connections uneven, remoteness could buy time. Time mattered because plague was not a mist settling evenly over the land. It had to arrive. Arrival depended on routes, seasons, people, goods, and carriers. A place difficult to reach might be lucky long enough to be spared in one wave, though perhaps not the next. The countryside, though, should not be romanticized. Rural life brought its own vulnerabilities. Households often lived close with animals. Hygiene could be poor. Medical help was scarce. If plague entered a small village, everyone knew everyone, and care obligations were immediate. Labor losses could wreck the harvest. In some regions, whole settlements declined or were abandoned in the later medieval period, though not all such abandonment was caused by plague alone. Climate, war, economy, and land use also mattered. The point is not that the countryside was safe. It is that its risks were structured differently. Lower density and fewer outside contacts could help. Isolation could also become abandonment if illness came and assistance did not. There is something almost painful in how mundane some of these differences are. A town with a weekly market versus one with a monthly market. A village on a pilgrimage route versus one off the route. A manor house that stores large quantities of grain versus one with smaller storage. A road usable through much of winter versus one often blocked by weather. A merchant family with rural connections versus one wholly tied to the city. A monastery near an urban hospital versus one far away in rough country. These do not sound like dramatic distinctions, yet in plague years they could shape mortality more than any grand speech or brave intention. The plague also exposed the danger of human clustering in moments of fear. Some communal responses, though understandable, deepened risk. Processions, crowded prayers, funerary gatherings, and late efforts to care for many sick people in shared spaces could turn compassion into exposure. But complete withdrawal carried its own human cost. Those who isolated successfully often did so because someone else continued essential labor. The wealthy family in retreat still required food, service, messages, and perhaps medical attendance. Isolation was easier if others remained connected to the world on your behalf. This is another uncomfortable truth. Survival can depend on invisible layers of labor beneath apparent seclusion. Urban elites often left memorable written traces because they had the means to document their experience. Yet many of the people whose positioning most affected survival left few records. Carters, porters, laundresses, field hands, cooks, grave workers, and boatmen moved goods, handled materials, cleaned spaces, prepared bodies, and maintained the physical links through which both life and disease traveled. Their work rarely survives in elegant narrative. But the plague's map cannot be drawn without them. If some people survived because they lived outside dense networks of exchange, others died because their labor kept those networks alive. There is also the question of household size and structure. A large household with many servants and frequent visitors might face higher risks of introduction than a smaller one, though more space could reduce crowding. A multi-generational home could become vulnerable if one member fell ill, especially if care required close contact. A scattered peasant household might experience fewer external visits, but if plague entered, there might be fewer caregivers left standing. Household structure is another reminder that place is not only about where you live on a map, it is about how many people share your rooms, your food, your tasks, and your breath. In some cases, communities that survived relatively well later interpreted that survival through religious language. A saint had protected them. Their local shrine had held firm. Their piety had been rewarded. Such interpretations were emotionally natural and socially useful. They gave meaning to uneven survival. Yet behind the sacred explanation may have been a more material story. Fewer traders, delayed arrival, sparse settlement, lower density, an early closure of roads, or simple luck. People almost always narrate survival after the fact. They turn it into evidence of virtue, wisdom, or favor. History is quieter. Often survival had less to do with moral distinction than with position in a network too large to see. This does not mean human action was irrelevant. Some responses clearly mattered. Avoiding crowds mattered. Reducing movement mattered. Delaying contact mattered. There is evidence across plague history that separation helped, even when applied imperfectly. The harder truth is that such action was not equally available to all. Choice is itself a kind of geography. The man in the field may withdraw more easily than the porter at the harbor. The noble may flee more easily than the servant required to pack his goods. The abbess may close her house to outsiders more easily than the parish priest who must serve the town. Once again, survival was not distributed fairly. By now, a pattern begins to emerge. Some people survived because they were in the right place. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say they were in a place that the plague reached less intensely, less quickly, or less often. Some were in valleys off the main roads. Some were in small settlements with little traffic. Some were on estates that cut themselves off. Some were behind gates closed early enough to matter. Some were in houses not yet visited by a traveler, a bundle of infested goods, or a coughing relative. These are unsatisfying answers if one is looking for heroism or secret knowledge. Yet they are among the truest. And still the mystery is not complete. Geography explains why one village might fare better than another, why one monastery lost fewer members, why one town was spared until later. It does not explain the survivors who stood inside heavily infected places and lived in the same household, under the same roof, with the same bells ringing outside. One person might die and another recover. In the same monastery, one monk buried 3 brothers and remained alive. In the same city street, one child lived where a parent did not. So even after we trace roads, ports, walls, markets, and distance, another question remains waiting beneath them all. What happened inside the body when exposure came? Why did some bodies fail at once, while others endured long enough to remain among the living? That is where the next layer of this dark puzzle begins. A city can explain part of an epidemic. A road can explain part of it. A port, a market, a monastery, a household crowded with servants or relatives, all of these help us understand why the plague reached some people and not others. But none of that fully answers the most intimate question. What about the person who truly was exposed, who lived in the dangerous place, who touched the sick, who developed symptoms, and yet did not die? What about the body that bent under the weight of disease and somehow did not break? That question is harder than the question of routes and geography, because bodies are difficult even for modern medicine. We can identify patterns, we can measure risk, we can compare groups, we can look at genes, nutrition, age, and previous illness. Yet even today, 2 people can face the same infection and experience very different outcomes. One falls gravely ill, another recovers. One carries lasting damage, another returns to ordinary life. The Black Death, seen from this angle, becomes not only a story about a disease traveling through Europe, but also a story about how individual human bodies differ from one another in ways that are partly visible and partly hidden. For people in the 14th century, such differences must have seemed almost impossible to interpret. If plague was punishment, why did punishment stop at one person and spare another sleeping nearby? If plague was poisoned air, why did 2 people breathing that air meet different fates? If plague came from corruption in the environment, why did one member of a household survive a fever that killed another? Medieval people did notice these contradictions. They had to. They were written into daily experience. The same home could contain the dead, the dying, the frightened, and the recovering all at once. A survivor was not only someone outside the plague. Sometimes a survivor was someone who had gone through it and remained standing. In modern terms, one answer lies in the immune system. The immune system is the body's way of detecting and fighting threats such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites. It is not one single organ. It is a network of cells, tissues, chemical signals, and responses working together. Some parts respond immediately in a general way. Other parts adapt more specifically. Some barriers try to stop infection before it spreads. Some cells attack invaders directly. Some coordinate the broader alarm. If this system responds quickly enough and effectively enough, a person may survive an infection that would kill someone else. If it responds poorly, too slowly, or in a way that damages the body itself, survival becomes less likely. This sounds straightforward when described calmly from the distance of centuries. Living through it was anything but straightforward. In a plague household, no one could say, "This daughter's immune response is stronger. That son's is weaker." They could only say that one grew feverish and then faded, while another seemed just as ill and yet stabilized. Recovery must have looked mysterious because the internal struggle was invisible. All anyone saw was the surface drama of the body: heat, swelling, weakness, cough, exhaustion, delirium, collapse, or return. But under that surface, bodies were reacting differently. Not every exposure produced exactly the same illness. That matters. A person bitten by an infected flea may have faced bubonic plague, with swollen lymph nodes, and a chance, however limited, of recovery. A person infected in a way that led quickly to bloodstream invasion may have developed septicemic plague, with a far worse outlook. Another person in close contact with someone whose lungs were involved may have encountered pneumonic plague, which was often devastatingly lethal. Even within those categories, the severity could vary. How much bacteria entered the body may have mattered. Where it entered may have mattered. How early the immune system responded may have mattered. Whether the person was already weakened from another illness, hunger, exhaustion, or chronic strain may have mattered too. The body is never just a body in isolation. It carries the history of the life around it. A well-fed merchant and an undernourished laborer might not begin infection from the same baseline. A child weakened by repeated hardship, a monk exhausted by care work, a woman recovering from childbirth, an older man already struggling with another disease, all would face plague differently. This does not mean that the healthy always survived and the weak always died. Plague was too brutal and too variable for that. Strong bodies failed, frail bodies sometimes lived. Still, general condition must have influenced the odds. Nutrition is one place where this becomes especially important. Medieval Europe before the Black Death was not a world of steady plenty for most people. Harvest failures, local shortages, hard winters, and unequal access to food shaped physical resilience. Even in years without famine, many people lived close to subsistence. Their diet might be repetitive, low in certain nutrients, and vulnerable to disruption. A body already undernourished does not fight infection as well as a body with stronger reserves. The plague did not strike a well-rested, medically supported population. It struck people whose immune systems were already shaped by work, weather, diet, age, pregnancy, previous infections, and long periods of physical strain. Age is another factor that seems obvious at first and complicated on closer view. In many modern infectious diseases, the very old and the very young are especially vulnerable. That pattern often holds because immune function differs across the lifespan, and because frailty increases risk. Yet plague history does not always present age in a perfectly simple way. Evidence from burial grounds, records, and later analysis suggests that mortality was high across many adult age groups. Some outbreaks hit young adults hard. Some populations show heavy losses among children. Some elderly people clearly died in large numbers. Part of the difficulty lies in the records themselves. Medieval evidence is uneven, and not every death was recorded with age. Another difficulty lies in the fact that plague was not one mild illness revealing only the weakest members of society. It was catastrophic enough to cut through age categories with terrible force. Even so, age probably altered the body's chance of enduring infection. Children whose immune systems were still developing may have faced special danger. Older adults, carrying the wear of decades of labor, malnutrition, or chronic illness, may also have struggled. Pregnant women likely faced severe risk, though evidence is fragmentary. The point is not to turn plague survival into a formula. It is to recognize that every body carried a different burden into the encounter. Previous illness matters too. A person who has been ill recently is often less resilient. Repeated infections, parasites, lung disease, chronic weakness, wounds, and untreated conditions could all shape whether a body resisted plague or failed beneath it. Medieval life exposed people to many hardships. modern medicine has made less common or more manageable. Poor dental health, skin infections, intestinal parasites, recurring fevers, injuries from labor, childbirth complications, and long periods of heavy work without recovery would all have formed part of the background. In that sense, plague did not strike blank bodies. It struck bodies with histories. And then there is the problem of dose, though medieval people could not have described it that way. Modern epidemiology often asks how much of a pathogen entered a person and through what route. A light exposure is not the same as an overwhelming one. Someone who briefly passes through a contaminated space may face different odds from someone spending hours in close contact with a severely ill patient. Someone handling infested cloth once may face different odds from a person sleeping night after night in a room full of respiratory infection. Even when two people appear, from a social point of view, to share an exposure, the biological reality may be far less equal. That matters because it helps explain why survival could look so unfair. A wife caring closely for a husband with pneumonic plague might receive a heavy respiratory exposure. A child sleeping in the same house but spending less time at the bedside might escape or contract a milder infection. A servant washing bedding may face a different danger from a relative praying in the doorway. A priest hearing confession in a small, close room may meet something different from the clerk who only records the death later. Such differences are almost never visible in surviving documents. History gives us the broad outline, not the invisible dose of bacteria moving through air, skin, or flea bite. Yet those hidden differences are part of the answer. Once we recognize that exposures varied and bodies varied, survival begins to look less supernatural. It remains tragic and uneven, but it becomes more understandable. Some people survived because their bodies were better able in that moment to contain the infection. Some may have mounted a stronger early immune response. Some may have avoided the most lethal pathways of disease even after being exposed. Some may have been nourished or rested enough to endure what others could not. Some may have encountered a smaller infectious burden. Some may simply have been lucky in biological ways that no one around them could see. Luck deserves its place here too, even in a section about bodies. One person's immune system may react a little faster. Another's lymphatic defenses may slow the spread just enough. Another may avoid a secondary complication by chance. Another may be cared for by someone who remains alive long enough to bring water and comfort through the worst days. Biology and luck are not enemies. In epidemic history, they often sit side by side, difficult to separate. Modern researchers have asked a deeper question as well. Did the Black Death leave marks not only on the people who lived through it, but on the descendants of those who survived? In other words, did plague act as a force of natural selection? If a disease kills many people and survival is influenced in part by inherited differences in immune response, then over generations the population that remains may not be genetically identical to the one that came before. This is a delicate subject because it is easy to oversimplify. Human populations are never shaped by one factor alone, and historical genetics is full of uncertainty. Still, the question is real and important. A number of modern studies have tried to identify genes or immune-related variants that may have been favored by plague selection. Some research has focused on how the Black Death may have increased the frequency of certain immune traits in European populations. One of the most discussed examples involves genes linked to inflammatory and immune responses, where some variants might have helped people survive certain bacterial infections more effectively. There has also been discussion of how traits beneficial in one epidemic context might carry costs in another, perhaps raising the risk of autoimmune disease later. That is one of the strange patterns of evolution. What helps in one environment may burden in another. We should move carefully here. Scientific debate continues, and not every proposed signal of plague selection is universally accepted. Ancient DNA studies, skeletal evidence, and genomic analysis are powerful tools, but they do not turn the past into a solved puzzle. They reveal patterns, probabilities, and plausible mechanisms. They do not allow us to point to any individual medieval skeleton and say with certainty, this person lived because of this gene. The evidence is population level, partial, and open to refinement. Yet even with caution, the idea is compelling. The Black Death may not only have killed millions, it may also have changed, in small but real ways, the biological inheritance of later populations. That possibility adds another layer to the meaning of survival. A survivor did not simply remain alive. A survivor may have passed on traits that shaped the health of later descendants. In that sense, the plague story reaches far beyond the burial pits of the 14th century. It enters the long history of the human immune system itself. But we should resist the temptation to turn this into a neat tale of stronger bloodlines emerging from catastrophe. Real biology is not heroic. It is statistical, uneven, and morally indifferent. Survival in plague years was not a reward for worthiness. It was the outcome of countless interactions between bodies, bacteria, environment, and chance. There is also evidence from archaeology and bioarchaeology suggesting that plague mortality was not entirely random with respect to pre-existing health. Studies of skeletons from medieval cemeteries have indicated that individuals showing signs of earlier physiological stress may have been at higher risk during plague outbreaks. This kind of research is valuable because bones sometimes record the hardships of life: malnutrition, repeated illness, developmental stress, heavy labor, and trauma. A plague cemetery, compared with pre-plague burial populations, can help historians ask whether the Black Death selectively killed the already weakened or cut across society more broadly. The answer seems to be both. It was widespread enough to kill many who had no obvious prior frailty, but those under greater stress may still have faced higher odds of death. That conclusion fits what we would expect biologically. A body already carrying the marks of hardship is less likely to withstand a severe infection. Yet plague was no ordinary filter. It did not only remove the visibly weak, it overwhelmed strong adults, clergy in active service, merchants in full work, and children alike. This again explains why medieval observers struggled to understand it. If only the frail had died, the event might have been interpreted differently. But when entire age groups, households, and institutions were hit, the disease looked like a force that ignored ordinary expectations. Bodies were also shaped by gender roles, though the exact mortality balance between men and women likely varied across places and outbreaks. In some contexts, social roles may have mattered more than biology itself. Women engaged in caregiving, washing, household service, and tending children may have faced certain exposures. Men involved in trade, transport, burial, or clerical service faced others. Pregnant women or women weakened after childbirth would have faced special vulnerability. Yet a simple male versus female division probably tells us less than the broader truth that work and biology met inside specific lives. A mother nursing a sick child, a young servant in a noble house, a priest hearing confessions, a merchant unloading cargo, all were bodies shaped by role as much as by sex. One of the quietest tragedies of survival is that it was rarely pure relief. A body might recover while the world around it emptied. A person who survived plague might wake into grief. Parents lived after children. Children lived after parents. Monks survived into half-empty cloisters. Servants remained in households where employers were dead. Farmers survived to fields lacking hands. Recovery could be physical, while life as a whole was broken. That emotional and social aftermath mattered, because health is not only the absence of fever. A body can endure infection and still carry loss, hunger, overwork, fear, and memory. We do not often think of trauma when we speak of medieval epidemics, yet it must have been everywhere. A person who survived after days of fever may have emerged into a street altered beyond recognition. Bells that once marked the hours had marked burials without end. Friends were gone. Work had changed. Religious certainty may have cracked. Even if the immune system had won the internal struggle, the survivor entered a psychological world remade by death. Some survivors likely faced long weakness too. Severe infection can leave the body exhausted. Care would have been limited. Food might be uncertain. Medical recovery in the modern sense scarcely existed. This is another reason it is hard to identify why a specific person survived. The records rarely say enough. A will may survive. A tax list may show someone present after an outbreak. A clerical register may reveal a vacancy not filled because a priest remained alive. Court records may resume under familiar names, but the body behind the document is mostly silent. Did that person survive because they had strong immune defenses? Because they were 20 rather than 60? Because they had eaten better in childhood? Because they received a lighter dose? Because they slept in another room? Because they left town for 3 weeks and returned at the right moment? Because a flea bit someone else first? History almost never tells us. So the honest answer to the mystery is not a single explanation, but a layered one. Some bodies endured because their internal defenses responded more effectively. Some endured because they were less weakened to begin with. Some endured because they faced a milder or different exposure. Some endured because of inherited traits we can only partly glimpse today. Some endured because of luck woven through physiology and circumstance. That layered answer may feel less satisfying than a dramatic secret, but it is truer to the human reality of plague. There is a final complication worth holding in mind. Survival in one wave did not guarantee survival forever. The Black Death was not only a single event in 1348. Europe would face later plague outbreaks again and again. A person spared in one season could die in another outbreak years later. A town that survived relatively well in the first Great Wave could suffer badly later. This matters because it reminds us that survival was often temporary, not absolute. People did not step out of plague into a permanently safe world. They stepped into a future where the disease might return. And yet, despite all those returns, the first Great Wave did alter Europe in a lasting way. It altered the balance of labor and land. It changed family lines, inheritance, religious feeling, memory, and power. The bodies that endured did not simply preserve individual lives, they carried Europe forward into a transformed age. Every recovered merchant, peasant, widow, novice, priest, mason, and child became part of the small bridge between the world that had existed before plague and the one that would emerge after it. That is why the question of survival matters so much. It is not only about medical curiosity, it is also about historical consequence. The people who remained alive after the fever passed were the ones who inherited fields, tools, houses, debts, workshops, grief, and sudden opportunities. They were the ones who filled emptied roles. They were the ones who asked what sort of life could be built after such a break. Some bodies endured, and because they endured, the structure of society itself began to shift. So we have moved from streets to microbes, from ports to villages, from roads to immune systems. We have seen that death was uneven because exposure was uneven, and because bodies were uneven too. But survival did not end at the edge of the sickbed. To live through plague was also to inherit its aftermath, and that aftermath was enormous. The people who survived the Black Death did not return to the old Europe. They opened their eyes inside a continent with missing voices, empty land, altered wages, shaken faith, and a future no one in 1347 would have recognized. When the worst days of plague began to loosen their grip in one town or one district, the change was not always dramatic. There was rarely a single morning when everyone woke and knew the danger had passed. The bells rang less often. Fewer carts moved toward burial ground. A market stall opened where one had stood empty for weeks. Someone who had kept shutters closed finally opened a window. A priest walked a lane without being called into every third house. The air itself did not become clean in any visible sense. The streets still held memory. Yet slowly, unevenly, the living began to notice that they were still there. That moment, if we can call it a moment, is one of the strangest in all of history. What does a society do after losing such a large share of its people? What does survival mean when survival places you in a half-emptied world? The title asks why some people somehow survived, and we have traced many of the reasons: place, timing, distance, exposure, work, luck, and the body's own defenses. But the story is not complete until we follow those survivors into the years after the fever, because plague did not only kill, it rearranged the living. One of the first things survivors inherited was absence made visible. Fields were left with too few hands to work them. Workshops stood quiet because a master had died, or an apprentice, or both. Houses passed suddenly to distant relatives, widows, orphaned children, monasteries, creditors, or no one at all. Legal routines broke down, then resumed in a thinner world. A manor still required labor. A city still required bread. A parish still required clergy. But everywhere there were gaps, and those gaps changed what was possible. In the countryside, labor shortages could become clear almost at once. Medieval agriculture depended on human effort at every stage. Land had to be plowed, planted, weeded, harvested, repaired, and guarded. Animals had to be tended. Mills had to operate. Tools had to be maintained. If enough workers vanished, the land itself changed. Some fields were abandoned. Some meadows spread. Some marginal lands were allowed to rest, because no one remained to force crops out of them. In certain regions, this could even improve conditions for the survivors, at least in material terms. With fewer people competing for land and resources, wages could rise and bargaining power could shift. That is one of the great paradoxes of the Black Death. It was a catastrophe beyond measure, and yet for some survivors, especially laborers in the decades that followed, it opened opportunities that had been much harder to imagine before. When labor becomes scarce, labor gains value. Lords still needed tenants, towns still needed workers, buildings still had to continue, food still had to be produced. A peasant who survived in a depopulated village might find that land once tightly controlled had become negotiable. A craftsman in a town with fewer rivals might command higher wages. A servant might move more freely between households. A widow might control property in ways that would have been more difficult before. Not everyone benefited, and not all regions changed in the same way, but the social balance had undeniably shifted. The people at the top of society noticed this quickly, and many did not welcome it. Medieval Europe was structured by hierarchy. Lords expected dues. Employers expected labor. Governments expected taxes. If too many workers died, the survivors could ask for more. That possibility frightened elites, not because they failed to understand arithmetic, but because they understood it very well. They could see what scarcity did to bargaining. In England, for example, the decades after the first Black Death wave saw attempts to freeze wages and restrict labor mobility, most famously through the Ordinance of Laborers of 1349 and the Statute of Laborers of 1351. These measures tried to push survivors back into older patterns of obligation, as if law could command the population to behave as though millions had not died. Such measures reveal something profound. The plague did not only create grief, it also created conflict over the meaning of survival. For a laborer, being alive in a depopulated economy might mean a rare chance to demand better terms. For a lord or state authority, that same demand looked like disorder. The struggle over wages, rents, and service tells us that survival carried political consequences. The living inherited not only empty houses and graves, but leverage. In some places, that leverage was temporary. In others, it contributed to deeper changes in the late medieval social order. Urban life shifted too. Cities had lost merchants, artisans, porters, clerks, priests, servants, and customers. Some trades were interrupted. Some guild structures were strained. Some offices had to be filled quickly because urban administration could not simply disappear. Property changed hands faster. Apprenticeships were altered. Migrants from the countryside might move into towns where openings existed. In this way, plague mortality could loosen older social boundaries while tightening others. A city did not recover by becoming what it had been before. It recovered by becoming something else. Inheritance became another powerful engine of change. If a parent, sibling, uncle, or child died, property moved. Sometimes the transfer was orderly. Often it was not. Wills multiplied in plague periods because people feared sudden death and tried to settle matters in advance. But death moved so quickly that not everyone made a will, and not every will was executed smoothly. Land, tools, homes, animals, and savings could pass unexpectedly to survivors who had not expected such responsibility. A younger son might inherit because older brothers were gone. A daughter might become the central surviving member of a line. A widow might manage resources on a new scale. A monastery might acquire donations made in fear. A lord might reclaim lands where tenants had vanished. These shifts were personal, but collectively they altered the distribution of property. For children, survival could be especially complicated. To live through plague as a child might mean living into orphanhood. A surviving child could inherit, and yet lose the very people whose presence made inheritance meaningful. Guardianship became important. Extended kin mattered. Some children likely rose in status because plague deaths moved them closer to property and position. Others likely fell into insecurity because too much support had vanished. Survival is often imagined as a clean outcome, but in plague years it could mean entering a life of radical instability. Women's positions also changed in ways that were significant, though never uniform. Widows formed a visible part of plague aftermath. Some managed workshops, homes, lands, or businesses in the absence of husbands. Some remarried into improved circumstances because labor and marriage markets had shifted. Some took on roles out of necessity rather than choice. Others were left vulnerable, especially where property rights were weak or kin networks had collapsed. Once again, plague did not produce one simple social result. It created openings and hardships at the same time. But it undeniably changed the distribution of responsibility, and many women became central actors in the post-plague world. Religious life was shaken deeply. Medieval Europe had long been structured by the Church, not only in doctrine, but in rhythm. Feast days, fasts, sacraments, burial, charity, law, and learning all passed in some way through religious institutions. The plague struck those institutions hard. Clergy died in large numbers. Monasteries lost members. Parish life was disrupted. The faithful saw prayers unanswered, priests overwhelmed, holy places unable to guarantee safety. For some, this deepened devotion. For others, it damaged trust. When a society built on sacred order experiences mass death that seems arbitrary, the spiritual consequences are enormous. We should be careful not to turn this into a simple story of lost faith. Many people responded to plague with intensified piety, gifts to the church, endowments, pilgrimage, or acts of repentance. Fear of death often strengthened religious commitment. Yet another truth existed at the same time. People saw clergy die like everyone else. They saw rites interrupted, comfort exhausted, and institutions strained. The emotional authority of religion remained, but it had been tested against catastrophe on a scale difficult to absorb. The years after plague were not spiritually empty. They were spiritually unsettled. That unsettlement can be felt in art and memory. Later medieval Europe shows a striking preoccupation with death, mortality, judgment, and the fragile line between life and decay. Images of skeletons, dancing, death, transience, and the equality of the grave became more prominent in cultural imagination. It would be too neat to say plague alone created this mood, since medieval Christianity had long reflected on mortality. Still, the Black Death intensified those themes and gave them lived weight. Death was no longer merely a sermon or a distant expectation. It had walked through households and workplaces. It had entered ordinary memory. Survivors carried that memory into everyday acts. A field plowed after plague was not the same field as before. A wedding held after plague took place in a parish with missing faces. A market restored after plague stood over absences everyone could name. Memory changes the meaning of routine. A loaf of bread, a tolling bell, the opening of a gate, the filling of a seat at table. These things can all become marked by what almost disappeared. This emotional inheritance is harder to document than wages or statutes. Yet it may be one of the deepest consequences of survival. There is also the matter of repetition. The Black Death was not a single event that ended neatly and never returned. Plague waves came again in later decades and centuries. Some outbreaks were local, some widespread, some less severe than the first great wave. But the memory of 1,348 remained alive because the danger remained imaginable. A survivor in the 1350s could not assume the world was done with plague. The future had become epidemiologically unstable. Every rumor of sickness from another town, every strange fever, every sudden cluster of deaths might call the old fear back into the room. This recurring threat shaped how communities governed themselves. It encouraged more organized public health measures over time. Ports became more cautious. Authorities learned the value of isolation, inspection, and delay. Lazarettos, quarantine stations, and structured controls would emerge more fully in later centuries, especially in Mediterranean trading states. These institutions were not products of perfect science, but they were the practical descendants of hard lessons learned through repeated plague. Survival, at the level of society, meant learning how to live under a recurring shadow. That shadow also influenced economic behavior. Families might become more cautious about inheritance. Institutions might reform recruitment. Because so many clergy had died, Landowners had to rethink labor supply. Towns had to adapt to smaller populations or encourage newcomers. Some regions experienced long-term demographic decline, others recovered more quickly. Recovery itself varied. A place with surviving commercial strength might rebound. A marginal settlement already under strain from poor soil or changing climate might never fully revive. In some parts of Europe, abandoned villages became part of the late medieval landscape. The plague did not create every abandoned settlement, but it contributed to a world where some places no longer had enough people to continue as before. The relationship between plague and broader historical change has been debated for generations. Historians have asked whether the Black Death accelerated the decline of serfdom in some regions, encouraged wage labor, weakened old feudal structures, and opened space for social mobility. The answer is not identical everywhere in Europe. In Western Europe, labor scarcity often strengthened peasants and workers more than it did in parts of Eastern Europe, where later developments could move in harsher directions. History never obeys a single continental script. Still, it is reasonable to say that plague acted as a powerful accelerator. It did not invent inequality, conflict, or social change. It magnified them. It exposed weak points. It redistributed pressure. It altered what rulers, landlords, workers, and families could demand from one another. Survival also meant carrying new responsibilities. A surviving mason might now be expected to do the work of 2 men. A surviving priest might serve more parishes. A surviving widow might manage property, children, and labor obligations at once. A surviving tenant might take on neighboring strips of land. A surviving merchant might inherit accounts, debts, and obligations from dead kin. So, even when survival opened opportunities, it often came with intensified burden. The living were fewer. The world's work had not become smaller. That burden helps explain why plague aftermath was not a simple rise into prosperity. Even in regions where wages improved, material opportunity can exist inside emotional ruin. A peasant may gain better terms while mourning half the village. A widow may control more property while carrying grief no record can quantify. A craftsman may earn more because skilled rivals are dead. In this way, the post-plague world forces us to abandon tidy categories. Were survivors fortunate? In one sense, yes. Were they burdened? Also yes. Did some benefit materially from catastrophe? Yes. Did that make the catastrophe any less real? Not at all. One of the most haunting aspects of survival is that it creates new social memory around chance. Families remember that one branch lived and another did not. Towns remember that one quarter was hit harder than another. Monasteries remember names in their necrologies. Such memories can shape identity for generations. They become part of local storytelling, even when the details blur. A chapel is founded because a family survived. A donation is made because a line nearly ended. A custom is observed because ancestors believed they were spared. These acts do not prove why survival happened, but they show what people did with the fact of having lived. If we return to the central promise of the title, the survivors of 1,348 did not survive for one reason. That is true medically, geographically, and socially. Some survived because death never found them in full force. Some survived because their bodies resisted longer. Some survived because a road, a season, a closed gate, a delayed ship, or an early flight changed their odds. Some survived because they were rich enough to withdraw. Some survived because they were remote enough to escape a wave. Some survived because they were lucky. In the precise moment exposure might have occurred. All of that is true, but one more thing must be added. They survived into consequences. Those consequences changed Europe. Land became more abundant relative to labor. Wages shifted. Legal systems strained to control the new reality. Clerical structures were rebuilt. Families reorganized. Markets adapted. Memory darkened. Art changed its emphasis. Public health grew more watchful. Social conflict sharpened around labor and authority. The Europe that emerged from the plague was not simply a repaired version of the old one. It was an altered continent. Even the idea of ordinary life changed. Before the plague, continuity might have seemed more natural. The world was unequal and often hard, but it was recognizably stable in its structures. After the plague, fragility had been displayed too clearly. People knew now, not in theory but from living memory, that a society could lose an immense share of itself in a short span. That knowledge does not disappear once learned. It enters law, prayer, family decisions, urban planning, commerce, and the imagination. Survivors do not merely go back. They carry awareness with them. This may help explain why the Black Death remains so gripping to later generations. It is not only the scale of death, it is the scale of survival. Millions died, yes, but millions also continued. They rebuilt, argued, worked, loved, buried, inherited, demanded, prayed, feared, and adapted. History often gives attention to collapse, but survival is also an event. A widow deciding how to manage land after losing children and kin is part of the event. A laborer refusing old wages is part of the event. A clerk recording empty tenancies is part of the event. A monk entering the choir with half the stalls vacant is part of the event. To survive is not to stand outside history. It is to become the material from which the next chapter is made. There is another, almost unsettling way to think about this. The people who survived the Black Death became the ancestors of later Europe in a more concentrated sense than usual. When mortality is that high, the lines that continue are shaped strongly by those who remain. Some carried possible immune advantages. Some carried property. Some carried memories that structured family life and local custom. Some moved into emptied positions of influence. Their choices mattered because there were fewer others to counterbalance them. Catastrophe narrows the human bridge between one age and the next. The survivors become the bridge. And still, for all these large consequences, the core human image remains small. A person opens a door and finds the street quieter than it should be. A market resumes, but there are faces missing. A field is plowed, but the neighboring strips lie still. A church is full enough to echo. A child grows up wearing clothes from the dead. A widow hears a new offer for labor that would once have been impossible. A landlord curses the cost of workers. A painter places death more prominently in an image. A city official decides ships must wait outside the harbor. None of these scenes alone explains the transformation of Europe. Together they do. Before we end, if these long, quiet walks through history are the kind of company you like in the late hours, subscribe and come back for the next one. And tell me, wherever you are listening from tonight, what place has received this story and what hour is resting outside your window right now? I always like the thought of these old worlds reaching modern rooms one listener at a time. So why did some people somehow survive when the Black Death killed so many? Because the plague was vast, but not even. Because Europe was connected, but not equally connected. Because bodies differ. Because work, wealth, care, distance, season, and timing all matter. Because some people encountered lighter exposure, or a different form of disease, or a body better able to endure it. Because a road carried infection to one village and not the next. Because a household closed itself early. Because a ship arrived late. Because a laborer happened not to be in the market on the wrong day. Because a child recovered from fever, while an older relative did not. Because luck, cruel and unteachable, never stopped playing its part. And once those people survived, they did not simply return to the old world. They inherited a Europe of silence, empty land, bargaining labor, unstable faith, reordered families, and sharpened memory. The plague killed many, but the survivors changed what came after. That may be the deepest answer of all. History did not move forward despite them. It moved forward through them, through the people who woke after the fever, stepped into altered streets, and realized that the future, however uncertain, now belonged to whoever was left.